you are. Mercy waiting just beyond my door.
John Paul II said, "In the mercy of God, the world will find peace and the mankind will find happiness."
Good evening. I'm very honored to be here. Sister Renata already gave me my introduction, so I won't waste any time, I guess, but thank you very much for the invitation. It really is a great honor, and also very wonderful to see you again. I used to hang around their convent in Boston for decades, showing up when they opened up in the morning and overstaying my welcome, I think, but it was a great pleasure. Anyway, I'm here. I will give my witness testimony. And as Sister mentioned, I'm a Jewish entrant into the Catholic Church. I think I'll talk a little bit about that also after the witness testimony part, and also a little bit about the role of Judaism in salvation history, and maybe even with a little bit of an angle towards Christmas and the transition between Judaism and the Catholic Church. So anyway, just to begin with my witness testimony, as Sister mentioned, I grew up Jewish, and my parents were both German Jewish Holocaust refugees. They both grew up in Germany and fled. My father fled very successfully to the United States. He left when it was still possible to leave. My mother's family was less fortunate. They fled to France, but France soon fell under the Nazis, and my mother was actually arrested by the Gestapo and awaiting a train to the concentration camps when she escaped. She was actually still in the custody of the French police, and she managed to escape from the French police and made it to the United States, where my parents met and married. My education growing up, my entire world growing up was entirely Jewish. I took God very seriously. I think I had a natural love of God. I couldn't imagine any religion being true other than Judaism. And I went to Jewish religious education from the beginning of school until university. I went to MIT, and there I lost my faith in God. I was basically kind of propagandized or brainwashed into thinking that religion was just a superstition that man came up with until he had science to give him the true answers to all the real questions. And any question that science can't answer today, it will be able to answer in 5 years. And under that influence, I actually felt that I could not in good conscience believe in God, that it would somehow be, I guess the expression is checking my mind at the door if I believed in God. And that the only kind of rational or scientific approach would be to decide that nothing exists except the materialism. Now, that was presented as a scientific worldview. I will make a short digression and say that's the opposite of a scientific worldview, because the essence of science is you look at the evidence, you look at the data, you form a theory that can successfully explain the evidence. If it can explain it, you can hold on to that theory, and if not, you have to discard it in favor of a theory which can explain the evidence. And I think because of the pseudoscientific attitude of our day, or the scientific attitude of our day, God has been uniquely generous in giving us physical, verifiable proofs of the truth of the Catholic faith. We all know about the miracle of the sun at Fatima that was seen by 80 or 100,000, including skeptics and atheists and communists and so forth. The medical miracles at Lourdes, which to be approved as a medical miracle, there has to be documented physical proof of the condition before. The condition after the healing has to be instantaneous, it has to be permanent, there has to be no possible materialistic explanation for the healing. And most interestingly, in some ways, are the Eucharistic miracles, because they're, of course, very uniquely point very specifically to the truths of the Catholic faith. And we don't only have the medieval Eucharistic miracles like Lanciano, but there was one in Buenos Aires, I believe in 1992, under, at the time, Archbishop Bergoglio, and one, I believe, in 98 in Buenos Aires, and one, I believe, in 2007 in Poland. And in all cases, the consecrated host had turned into human blood and human muscle tissue from the heart. And it was examined by forensic scientists with the full range of scientific examination. And it was that, and they were not told the source of the sample before they gave their conclusions, that it was the human blood and human muscle tissue of a man who had died in great agony. And in at least one of the cases, it was examined under an electron microscope, and you could actually see the cells, essentially the bread cells, morphing into the human muscle cells in a continuous way. There was no discontinuity, there was no separation. They just one kind of just blurred into the other, which none of this could be faked, with the full range of, NSA science or something today. So anyway, it's the opposite of a scientific worldview to dismiss the truths of the Catholic faith. It's quite the opposite. If you're going to be honest about looking at the evidence, it's going to drive you to the conclusion that there certainly must be something more than materialism, and in fact is going to point very specifically to the Catholic Church. G.K. Chesterton has a quote: "Rightly or wrongly, those who believe in miracles believe in them on the basis of the evidence, and rightly or wrongly, those who do not believe in miracles refuse to believe in them on the basis of faith." So it's exactly the opposite of what I was taught at MIT, essentially. Nonetheless, I did believe what they taught at MIT, and I was essentially atheist when I left, and then I went on to Harvard Business School, and I did well enough there to be invited back to join the faculty upon receiving my MBA. So I joined the faculty as a newly minted professor of marketing at Harvard Business School at the ripe old age of 29, and that's really where my witness testimony begins. Because all my life, since I was a small child, I felt there has to be a real meaning and purpose to life, and someday when I'm older, I'll come into the real meaning and purpose of life, which as a child I thought would come into entering a personal relationship with God, which I thought would happen at my bar mitzvah, which is a ceremony when the child is about 13. He enters into religious adulthood in a ceremony in the synagogue. It's quite parallel in some ways to the Catholic confirmation. And I honestly thought that at my bar mitzvah, somehow the veil would drop and I would enter into this personal relationship with God. And when that didn't happen, it was one of the saddest days of my childhood. But then pretty soon I decided the real meaning and purpose of my life would come when I got a driver's license, or if I got into MIT, or when I left home, or when I got a girlfriend, or if I got into Harvard Business School, or when I began my career. But the problem was, at this point, I was already more successful in my secular career than I ever expected to be, being a professor at Harvard. But there was still no meaning or purpose to life. We were just a chemical accident, and a bolt of lightning hit a puddle of amino acids 5 billion years ago, and eventually we crawled out. And we live for 80 or 90 years and die, and that's it, and there's no meaning or purpose or pattern to anything. And it was a very bleak prospect, but at this point there was nothing more I could imagine might give my life meaning. So I actually fell into the deepest despair of my life at that point. And it was in that I was walking in nature early one morning. It was behind the sand dunes on Cape Cod. And that was where I found comfort in those days, was being alone in a beautiful spot of nature. And I had long since ceased believing. Actually, I had long since thinking I was essentially allowed to believe in the existence of God. And I was just lost in my thoughts, walking along, when from one moment to the next, the veil separating the physical world from the spiritual world disappeared, and I found myself seeing into the spiritual world. There was a lot that I saw seeing into the spiritual world just having to do with nature and the angelic hierarchy and so forth. But that wasn't the most powerful part of this experience. It was actually secondary. By far the most powerful part of this experience was falling into the direct presence and experience of an intimacy with God, a communion with God, a experience and understanding of His infinite, unimaginable, very personal love for me. I saw a lot of the truths of the faith in this experience. I didn't know they were truths of the faith. I knew nothing about the Catholic faith. I had never touched, by the way, a New Testament at this point. But I fell into this communion with God where it was like I had a searchlight on my forehead. I couldn't ask myself a question without being shown the answer. I saw the truth of divine providence, that here all my life I had worried, I had thought like, oh, if only that hadn't happened, then I would be happy today, or if only that hadn't happened, then I would be happy today. When in fact, absolutely everything that had ever happened to me had been the most perfect thing that could be arranged by divine providence, not only including those things that had caused the most suffering at the time, but especially those things that had caused the most suffering at the time. I saw that here I had worried about life having no meaning, when in fact every moment has in some sense, infinite depth of meaning, because every moment has the possibility for a moral action that has a moral content. And if we take advantage of the opportunity to do something of value in the eyes of heaven, we will very literally be rewarded for all eternity for that. And every opportunity we let go by and don't take advantage of will be a lost opportunity for all eternity. I saw how foolish I had been, putting all my time and energy into accumulating things that wouldn't do me any good even 100 years later after I was dead. And that if I didn't see that it was wrong to be selfish, but what I saw was that I had been stupidly selfish, and if I wanted to be smart and selfish, the only thing that made sense would be to try to use every moment, basically acquiring merit in heaven. I know that's not really a great attitude. It was purely selfish, but in my defense, I'll say I was a Harvard Business School marketing professor, so what do you expect? That's a graduate degree in selfishness. But the stupidity was shown to me. By far, the biggest part of this experience, though, growing up Jewish, it never occurred to me that God even knew me as an individual, knew me by name. And then I in this experience, I experienced that God not only knew me by name, not only had arranged everything in my life to be the most perfect thing that could happen, coming from this all-knowing, all-loving God, but he had been paying attention to me and caring about me at every moment of my existence as though I were the only creature he had ever created, and as though, in a very real way, everything that made me happy made him happy, and everything that made me sad made him sad. And it absolutely changed everything. I mean, there obviously was never any reason to be anxious about anything. There was obviously, this infinite meaning to every moment of life. I better stop there, actually, because I'm just kind of drowning in it. But I went back to Cambridge, where I lived at the time, happier than I had ever been. I knew there was never any reason to be anxious. I knew that what awaited us after death, if we played our cards right, was greater than we could ever imagine. And the biggest thing was I knew that God, God himself, the God who had created not only everything that exists, but existence itself, not only knew me by name, not only was taking care of me and arranging everything, but was caring about me and aware of how I felt at every moment and caring about how I felt at every moment. Anyway, I was obviously walking on air. I instantly had lost any interest in teaching Harvard MBAs how to make any more money, how to make a little bit of money, whatever. And all I wanted to do was find out who this God was and what religion to follow, to worship and serve him properly, and to work on my heavenly bank account, frankly. Now, during this experience, I knew this was God. I knew him as my Lord and Master and God, but I didn't know who he was and what religion this was. And I wanted to, obviously. Now, I now know that, of course, it was the God of the Old Testament, the God of Judaism, but I couldn't think of this as the God of Judaism. I couldn't think of this as Judaism. The picture of God that emerges from the Old Testament is, of course, of a God much more distant and severe and impersonal in some sense than this God was. It's not because of an error in the Old Testament. It's because, in fact, the fundamental relationship between God and man was transformed by the incarnation of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity and the coming of Jesus, and then the coming of the Holy Spirit after his death. In some sense, was the point of the whole thing. There is a prophecy, I believe it's in Joel. The day is coming, says the Lord, when you won't have to run to this person and that person to ask him about God, but I'll make myself known to the lowliest maidservant and manservant among you. And St. Peter, in the first Pentecost Sunday sermon, actually cited that prophecy and said, this is what has happened. In the Old Testament, you will see that God does not communicate with individual ordinary people at all. He only speaks through the prophets. Even King David, when he had to find out what his sin was, had to go to Nathan the prophet to find out from God what he had done wrong and so forth. So my picture of God, I came by naturally. I know I'm going down all these side roads. So anyway, in this experience, I was walking along. I knew that this was my Lord and God and Master. And I prayed to him as I was walking, let me know your name so I know what religion to follow to worship and serve you properly. I don't mind if you're Buddha and I have to become Buddhist. I don't mind if you're Krishna and I have to become Hindu. I don't mind if you're Apollo and I have to become a Roman pagan, as long as you're not Christ and I have to become Christian. And I very literally prayed that. I obviously wasn't ready to hear, and he didn't reveal his name to me. But I went back home, as I said, happier than I had ever been. All I wanted to know who this God was and what religion to follow. So every night before going to sleep, I would say a short prayer I had made up to know the name of my Lord and God and Master who had revealed himself to me that day. And a year to the day after that initial experience, I went to sleep, and after saying a short prayer of thanksgiving for what had happened exactly a year earlier, which is how I know that it was exactly a year. And I went to sleep, and I thought I was woken by a hand gently on my shoulder and led to a room and left alone with the most beautiful young woman I could ever imagine. And I knew without being told that it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. When I found myself in her presence, all I wanted to do was fall on my knees and somehow honor her appropriately. In fact, the first thought that crossed through my mind is, oh my gosh, I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary. But I didn't. Now, the first thing she said to me, let me back up and say, I now understand that had there been a video camera in my bedroom at the time, it would have shown me asleep in bed throughout this experience. I can only describe it as I experienced it and as my memory represents it, which was as a fully awake experience. But I know that it was, in some sense, something else. But I remember, the experience did not in any sense feel like a dream. I thought I was completely awake. I remember it word for word. I remembered as though I was awake, essentially. So anyway, the first thing she said to me was she offered to answer any questions I might have for her. I'll go into that a little bit, but before I do, let me say that she was absolutely, perfectly, unimaginably beautiful. That was totally overwhelming, of course. But even more powerfully affecting than the beauty of looking at her, of seeing her, was the beauty of her voice. The only way I can describe it is that her voice was made up out of that which makes music music. And when she spoke, this incredibly beautiful voice passed through me, carrying with it her love and lifting me up into a state of ecstasy greater than I ever imagined could exist. So the first thing she said to me was she offered to answer any questions I might have for her. The first question I wanted to ask her was to teach me the Hail Mary, because I still didn't know it and I wanted to honor her appropriately. But I was too proud to admit I didn't know the Hail Mary, so as a kind of indirect way of getting her to teach me the Hail Mary, I asked her what her favorite prayer to her was. Her answer was a little bit sideways. Her first answer was, I love all prayers to me. But I was a little bit pushy, and maybe that's my background, who knows. But I said, but you must love some prayers to you more than others. And she relented, and she recited a prayer, but it was in Portuguese, and I didn't know any Portuguese. So all I could do was make the effort to remember the first few syllables phonetically And then the next morning when I woke up, I wrote them down phonetically. And then much later, when I met a Portuguese Catholic woman, I asked her to recite the prayers to Mary in Portuguese. And to the best of my ability, I identified the prayer as, O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. I asked her about 6 or 7 other questions, and I'll mention the worthwhile ones. Some of the questions were personal, one of the questions was incredibly silly. But in any case, most of the questions came from simply being overwhelmed by who she was. I'll bypass that for a moment, but I was absolutely overwhelmed by who she was. I actually saw in this experience how she is the conduit between divinity and humanity, and that all of the graces and gifts that flow from divinity into humanity flow through the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, that's dogma, even though it hasn't been specifically pronounced as dogma, it is dogma, that none of the graces that flow to humanity earned by Christ in his sacrifice flow to humanity other than through the hands of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Of course, I didn't know that, but I saw it. Actually, in some sense, it was as though I saw her as a funnel, sort of, that connected to the Godhead, and through which all of the grace that flowed into humanity flowed through her and then out into humanity. Anyway, so most of my questions just came from being overwhelmed, needless to say. At one point I asked her, it was more of an exclamation than a question, but I said, how can it be? How is it possible? How can it be that you're so glorious, that you're so magnificent, that you're so exalted? How can it be? And her response was to look down at me almost with pity and shake her head gently and say, oh no, you don't understand. You don't understand anything. I'm nothing. I'm a creature. I'm a created thing. He's everything. And then again, out of a desire to honor her somehow appropriately, I asked her what title she liked best for herself. And her reply was, I am the beloved daughter of the Father, mother of the Son, and spouse of the Spirit. Now, by now I figured out that if this is the Blessed Virgin Mary, it was Christ in that earlier experience, and this is all about Christianity, and I had better get up to speed pretty quick. And as I said, I never had even touched a New Testament, but all my life I had heard the expression, the Holy Spirit. I had no idea what it meant. So I apologized for the way I asked the question. I didn't know any better, but I said to her, what's this business about the Holy Spirit? And her response was just to look upwards with an expression melting with love and say, he's his gaze. So the questions went downhill from there. I asked her a few more questions. Then she said she had something she wanted to speak to me about. She spoke for another 10 or 15 minutes. Then the audience was ended. I went back to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I knew it had been Christ in that first experience. I knew I wanted nothing other than to be as fully and completely a Christian as possible. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant. But when I woke up that morning, I was like hopelessly and terminally in love with the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, my first thought when I woke up was, oh boy, I can't wait to go to sleep again tonight and see her again. And when that didn't happen, I figured, well, it's going to happen, once a week or once a month or once a year or something. And that was a grace, because by the time I realized I would have to go through, 50 or 60 years of this life before I got to see her again that way, the memory had faded to the point where I could face the prospect. But if I had known that morning, there was no way I could have faced the prospect. Everything in this world was so drab and colorless and gray and tasteless and cardboard compared to being in the presence of her love, that it would have been a very, very, very distressing prospect. So anyway, I didn't know the difference between a Protestant and Catholic. I opened a local phone book and started going to a Protestant church. As soon as I got comfortable with the pastor, I kind of shyly asked him about the Blessed Virgin Mary. When he answered without the respect that I knew that she deserved, I knew this is no place for me. And the other thing I was doing in these days was there was a shrine to Our Lady of La Salette about 45 minutes from my house outside of Boston. And I would go up there 4 or 5 times a week just to walk the grounds and feel her presence and sort of commune with her. I still didn't actually know anything about Catholic prayer. I still didn't actually know the Hail Mary. You know, it's not easy to learn the Hail Mary. You know, I kept going to bookstores and getting these little books on how to say the rosary, and they'd say Hail Mary, ... Hail Mary, ... Hail Mary, ... But anyway, so I would walk the grounds, and sometimes there would be a mass going on, and whenever I was around a mass going on, I was filled with this tremendous, almost like lust to receive the Eucharist, even though I didn't know what it was. So that's what led me pretty directly into the Catholic Church, was knowing who the Blessed Virgin Mary was and wanting to receive the Eucharist daily, if at all possible. Now, I will tell a little anecdote. Because it illustrates a lot of what I'm talking about. I knew about the shrine to Our Lady of La Salette near my house. The following winter, I went skiing in France, in the French Alps. It rained for a few days. I wasn't that far away from the real La Salette, where Mary had appeared in, I think it was 1846, to 2 shepherd children high in the French Alps. The rain made the skiing kind of dreary, so I decided to get in my rental car and drive to La Salette, which I did. And I ended up staying there actually for the rest of the trip. And there was a elderly French Catholic woman there who I became friendly with. And then when I got home, she called me up and she said, I think you should check out the Carthusians. Now, some of you probably know who the Carthusians are, since this is a pretty hardcore crowd, but they're the strictest contemplative religious order in the church. They live in solitary confinement, essentially. They live in very strict silence. They eat 1 meal a day. They never sleep through the night. They break sleep every night. They sleep for about 3 hours and then spend 2 hours in chapel chanting psalms, and then they go back to sleep for a few hours, and then they have mass. I shouldn't say they never talk to each other, but they never talk to each other except for like 1 or 2 hour recreation once a week. And even then they talk only. It's a very regimented way of speaking, and so forth. And so she told me about the Carthusians, and I said to myself, I was dying to meet somebody who could tell me about what had happened to me, who knew about this kind of experience, mystical experience. And when she told me about him, I said to myself, well, these guys must know about mystical experiences, or they'd go nuts with such a rigorous penitential life. So I went to the Carthusian monastery. I was still Jewish. I was still anti-Catholic. I was still incredibly arrogant, by the way, as a Harvard Business School professor. But 4 things happened there that turned me around. Okay? And that's why I wanted to say it. The first thing that turned me around was I was in a cell, and the prior would come to me every day, once a day, after the one meal of the day, lunchtime, and knock on my door to see if I had any questions and to offer me any spiritual direction if I wanted. And, he would answer any questions and then go away. And I kept expecting him to give me a sales pitch about why I should become Catholic. So he'd come, and I think, okay, today he's going to give me the sales pitch, but he didn't. He would just, ask if I had any questions and go away, and then the next day and the next day and so forth. So finally, I couldn't stand the suspense. So the next day when he knocked on the door, I threw it open and I said, kind of in his face, aren't you going to tell me why I should become Catholic? And his response was, he just said, no, not at all. All I ask of you is that you keep your eyes open and you be honest with yourself about what you see. This was the exact opposite of what I had always been taught about a Catholic Church, how heavy-handed they are and so forth, and forced conversions. And I now know he knew the truth. God was at work. God wasn't going to stop. This was the work of the Holy Spirit, and all I had to do was keep my eyes open and be honest with myself about what I saw. So a huge brick fell from my kind of defensive posture towards the Catholic Church. The next thing that happened was, after a few days, I began joining the monks in choir from essentially midnight to 2 a.m. And it was a beautiful, 16th century monastery, these big, heavy walnut stalls. The monks would share a parchment, psalm book, beautiful, illustrated, hundreds of years old, with one big book between the two monks. And they would be standing there through the night, every night, like 2-3 hours, chanting, "O Jerusalem, should I ever forget you? Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. And O Zion, no place on earth is as beautiful as you." And I'd be looking around at all these old monks saying to myself, these guys are all wannabe Jews. And then one day I was doing my job, which was scything grass in the orchard, when an elderly monk shuffled out to me. Since they're not allowed to talk, sometimes they took advantage to perhaps bend the rules a little bit. And he shuffled out to me, and he kind of shyly said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And I said, "Not at all." And he said, "Well, then, if you don't mind me asking, you're not Catholic, are you? Because we noticed you weren't receiving communion." And I said, "No, that's right. I'm not Catholic." And he said, "Well, then, if you don't mind me asking, because we were all wondering, what are you then?" And I stood up tall and said, "I'm Jewish." And he said, "Oh, that's a relief. We were all afraid you were Protestant." So you see, in those last two experiences I related, I saw the true Catholic view of the relationship between Judaism and the Catholic Church, which is, of course, that Judaism was the first phase of salvation history, designed to lead up to the fulfillment of salvation history, which is the Catholic Church. The final thing that happened there, and perhaps the most important, is that if anyone had told me about the life these monks lead, never sleeping through the night, very penitential, one meal a day, as I said, solitary confinement, and so forth, I would have expected to see a bunch of bitter, grumpy old men. And instead, they were like kindergartners running around sharing a little secret on the verge of giggles. And I knew that what filled their life with joy and a kind of beautiful feminine presence was the presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I felt when I was there how it's as though the Blessed Virgin Mary is the animating spirit of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is the institutional structure around the Blessed Virgin Mary. So by the time I left, my love for the Blessed Virgin Mary had essentially become a love for the Catholic Church and a desire to become Catholic. So that is my witness testimony. And now, in the remaining 4 minutes, I'll go through 4,000 years of salvation history. Anyway, it's a great joy to be doing this. Of course, I'll be, up at the fellowship, so so I'll be talking. What I mean. Anything, you have any questions or anything, I'll be talking more. But I'm only allowed to talk here for a very specific amount of time. So, okay, I alluded to this. I just want to run through it very briefly. It was obvious to me that Judaism and the Catholic faith are not two genuinely distinct religions. They are two phases of the same plan for salvation for all of mankind, a preparatory phase, a preparation phase to prepare for the incarnation of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity as a man, which of course is what Judaism was, to prepare for the incarnation of Jesus, so that with the fruits of the incarnation, and of course the life, passion, and death of Jesus, that initial favored relationship between God and man, which was given to the Jews basically only for their role to prepare the way for the incarnation, would be extended to all of mankind, infinitely greater way, through faith in Jesus and the sacraments of the Catholic Church. So Judaism is essentially pre-Messianic Catholicism, and Catholicism is essentially post-Messianic Judaism. At the time of the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, God knew that at some point in the future, He would not only restore man to the original elevated, exalted state that Adam had in the Garden of Eden, right? No suffering, no death, and so forth, but raise mankind to an infinitely higher state through the incarnation of God as man. If God was going to incarnate as man, a people would have to be prepared. They would have to be separated out from all the people on earth. They would have to be given a tremendous amount of divine revelation to, first of all, know about the one true uncreated God, to know about the creation of man, the fall of man, the seriousness of sin, the need for redemption, the future coming of a Redeemer. They would have to be given enough divine revelation to understand all of this, to identify the Redeemer when he came, and to have enough of grounding in theology to spread the faith throughout the world after he came. They would also, by the way, have to be given a lot of mechanisms and a lot of rules to keep them separate for 2,000 years from everyone else wandering the face of the earth, because, of course, the entire world was tribal, and the tribes were always warring and absorbing each other and intermarrying and so forth. And that's basically the story of Judaism. And in fact, a lot of the unpleasant things you see about the Jews in the Old Testament, you could imagine were given to them precisely to keep them separate. For instance, the way they couldn't have any, right, the way that the Gentiles were unclean and they couldn't have any dealings with them and they couldn't eat with them and they couldn't touch them and so forth, was, you could see as a mechanism to keep them separate for 2,000 years and so forth. But anyway, they were given this task to enable the incarnation, to bring about the incarnation, so that after the incarnation, we would have the fullness of redemption through Jesus. Also, because I promised Sister I would mention this, they also were chosen to produce over the generations a virgin of such purity and nobility that she could give her flesh and blood to be the flesh and blood of the God-man when he came. And that, of course, is the Blessed Virgin Mary. So you could see, in some sense, that Judaism crescendoing in the Blessed Virgin Mary was kind of the ultimate fulfillment of Judaism, to produce the Blessed Virgin Mary to enable the incarnation to take place in her. So I guess that's it. How's that? A half an hour on the dot. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'll be upstairs if you want more. You can sicken yourself with more of me. My name, I hope, is written somewhere because no one can spell it unless they read it. But I have a YouTube channel, and I have hundreds of hours of lectures and talks and videos and podcasts and everything on there. I have a couple of books. Salvation is from the Jews, which is the theology, and Honey from the Rock, which is witness testimonies and so forth. Anyway, this is just a little teaser, a little introduction, and also a big thank you to the sisters for their role in my life. And I hear that sometimes my witness testimony helps people with their faith, so that's even better. So, and also, of course, I'm still working on my bank account in heaven, so I have a good selfish reason for doing this. Thank you. Oh, please no applause, but thank you very much.
And you are mercy waiting just beyond my door.
John Paul II said, "In the mercy of God, the world will find peace, and the mankind will find happiness."